last time we spoke about several of Israel's wars. We sort of worked our way through the Ottoman period, and then we got to World War I, where we had a number of small borders and skirmishes between the different elements of Israel. Pre-Israel, we talked about the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which was the first manifestation of unified Arab resistance. It was still rather divided and disorganized, but it was the first time that they had united, and they united under this Sheikh Izzeddin Qassam, who's considered the grandfather of Palestinian Islamist militancy, and we'll discuss more about that as time goes on. Eventually, you have the various attempts at partition, leading to Israel's independence conflict, right? And we talked about this. This was the first time that the state of Israel existed with a unified military. That military was unified in the middle of the war, because Israel only became independent in the middle of the conflict. The conflict started on November 30th, 1947. Israel declares independence on May 14th, 1948, and the conflict doesn't end until April of 1949. After that conflict, the territory that Israel had was 78% of the former British Mandate. We talked about how once Israel was in control, they were in control of a number of Arab populations. The majority of the Arabs from the territory had fled. 720,000 of them became refugees in the various refugee camps or fled to other third-party countries, but a number of them remained in Israel. About 150,000 of them remained in Israel, and they constituted a minority, but they were a minority under military watch until 1966. At the same time, you had large-scale Jewish expulsions from the Arab world, up to 850,000. Some numbers place it at 1 million, and 500,000 of those make their way to Israel. So we then see what are called the Fedayeen, right? We saw that there were these raids cross-border where individual militants would be sponsored primarily by Egypt, but also to a certain degree by Jordan, Syria, or Lebanon to cross the border and try and attack Israeli border positions. The Israeli military police were involved in stopping these Fedayeen, and it was a low-scale conflict. We then talked about the wider Arab socialist world fighting against Israel. We saw that in the Suez Crisis, we saw it in the Six-Day War, and we saw it in the War of Attrition, and finally we saw it in the Yom Kippur War. And all those 4 wars were basically this conflagration of Arab states trying to oppose Israel. And so Israel was boxed in on all sides. Jordan increasingly pulls out of these wars, right? The War of Attrition is the last time we see Jordan, because Jordan is fighting the Battle of Karama with Israel in 1968. In the Yom Kippur War, you can see it's only Egypt and Syria. But after this point, right, Egypt makes peace with Israel. Egypt makes peace with Israel. And so, by and large, the Arab states have pulled themselves out of the conflict. And it really becomes a conflict between Israel and either Lebanon or entities within Lebanon or Palestinians. So, as we mentioned last time, the Palestinian identity is something that is a modern creation, right? We don't have people in the Middle Ages saying, I'm a Palestinian. That's just not what's going on. We have references to the term Palestini to refer to people in a national sense in the late 1800s. We have some examples of that. But as a term that most Arabs from the southern Levant would have used to identify themselves, this term really comes into vogue in the 1960s. Because prior to that point, the term Palestinian was often used to refer to anybody from the Mandate, especially Jews.
I'm sorry, Richard. So, what do they call themselves in the 1800s?
Sure,
the people
they called themselves Levantines, Syrians, or in Arabic it's Shawam, Shami Shawam. So that was the term that they typically used for themselves, right? They didn't see that there was a distinctness to living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. They saw themselves as being the same people as the ones in Lebanon, the same ones as in Jordan, the same ones as in southern Syria. They saw a distinction between themselves and, let's say, Egyptians or Iraqis, but between the specific borders of Mandatory Palestine did not confer upon them a unique ethnic identity. Think about it the same way that, like, for example, northern Italy was broken up into numerous different city-states, right? You had Tuscany and Venice and Genoa, but these people wouldn't consider themselves ethnically Genoese or ethnically, Florentine or ethnically Venetian. They were Italian ethnically. They just happened to be citizens of these various countries. The consciousness of a unique national identity took time to form, and that's what I'm calling Palestinianism. The idea that there is such a thing as a unique Palestinian people. So, so the first major development in the rise of Palestinianism, of course, was the result from being expelled from Israel during the Independence War. And so you can see the refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in the West Bank, and in Gaza.
Time zone, US or even anywhere in the world for that matter, as long as they could do the work remotely. I think that might really change our views on what it is to work. And I think that's.
Can you please mute yourself?
Because if that becomes the trend.
Hello?
I'm sure a lot of you have,
Okay, hold on.
little examples
Hold
of
on.
how your
Sorry.
day-to-day work is fundamental.
Ralph, are you talking to us?
No. Well, wait a minute. I can't find my mute. Oh, here it is. Okay, sorry.
Okay. So you have this Palestinian national identity that's developing because of the political situation, right? In the lower left, you have the government of what is called Hukumat, the government of all Palestine, and that this government is ruling Gaza. It's an Egyptian puppet government. You can see the All Palestine government passport right next to it. And this government exists pretty much until 1956, because Israel invades the Gaza Strip during the Suez Crisis. When Israel pulls out, the Egyptians just decide to rule it directly as a military enclave. And Jordan rules the West Bank until Israel takes it. In fact, the Jordanian parliament had seats for the West Bank constituencies until 1988. Despite the fact that Jordan didn't control the West Bank after 1967. And despite the difference in size, roughly a third to half of the Jordanian population lived in the West Bank. Which is why today, over 60% of Jordanian citizens are ethnic Palestinians.
Richard, and the people, when they live in Jordan and Syria, do they have the same rights of the Syrians? What was the legal status of them?
Sure. In the different countries, the legal status was different. So in Egypt, they were not put into camps. They were allowed, to live in the general areas, but they didn't have residency papers, which meant that they couldn't get proper jobs. They can get jobs, they just can't get proper jobs. And becoming educated and getting travel documents was very difficult for them. Things have changed somewhat in the last 2 decades, but not significantly. In Jordan, the situation legally is rather complicated. For the Palestinians who left during the 1947 to 1949 war, Israel's independence war, those Palestinians generally have been made Jordanian citizens. The Palestinians that came during the second wave of migration in 1967, because there were a number of Palestinians who left the West Bank or left Israel proper during the invasion of the West Bank in 1967 during the Six-Day War, those Palestinians were not given Jordanian citizenship and put exclusively in the camps. Now, there are a number of Palestinians from 1949 that existed in the camps, and those ones never got Jordanian citizenship. So you sort of have 3 categories: the ones who came in 1949 and got citizenship because they moved to Jordan proper, the ones who came in 1949 and did not move to Jordan proper, stayed in the West Bank and so did not become citizens, and those who came in 1967 who all unanimously did not become citizens. In Jordan, they often have some rights to work. It's unclear exactly how it's delimited, but it's a significant issue because some Palestinians are Jordanian citizens with full rights, and some Palestinians are not, and some Palestinians are not Jordanian citizens.
Can you also, Richard, talk about the impact of the PLO and the Black September movement?
That's actually the next slide.
Okay, awesome. Just how that completely, the ramifications of that to Palestinian rights the last.
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, Rich, one question.
Sure.
Do you know anything about the Black Prince?
No, I'm not familiar with Black Prince.
The ones responsible for the Munich massacre?
I don't know the name of the person responsible.
I was just wondering if he's related in somehow.
No, he was definitely a Palestinian terrorist.
Exactly.
We're going to get to Munich 1972.
Okay,
which is sort of moving chronologically.
And, what about the Palestinians that got to Syria before the Black September?
Black September's in Jordan.
But they went from Jordan to Syria.
No, they went from Jordan
to Lebanon. I'm sorry,
yeah,
to Lebanon.
We're gonna get there. Trust me, we're gonna get there.
Right. But those before, you're talking about status of Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So in Syria they have residency rights, but they don't have working rights. So they can live outside of the refugee camps. Some of them, most of them don't choose to live outside the refugee camps. Most of them choose to live inside of them.
Richard, I'm sorry. So it's like illegals here, but legal.
Yes.
I mean, they didn't have any rights. They didn't. What? I mean, medical. What if they get sick? I mean, what? How do they?
Well, I mean, remember, most of these places don't have state-based healthcare systems to begin with.
Right. I mean, the thing is that UNRWA has makeshift hospitals as part of the refugee camp structure. But in terms of consistent medical care, they're probably not getting it.
Yeah,
and if they want to buy property, I mean, it was like here, like you're illegal and you're, okay. So you don't have any rights.
Yes, correct. You do not have.
Technically, you don't have any rights.
Yeah, and in Lebanon, it's probably the worst in terms of the rights situation. They are not allowed to leave the refugee camps in many cases. Not even to work, not even if the work is illegal work, right? Like they literally cannot leave the camps. And in Lebanon in particular, and we're going to address this, Lebanon is an ethnic mix. And so the Palestinians, being a 400,000 person population with a total Lebanese population of around 4 million, they would be a significant ethnic bloc and rearrange a lot of the formulas that constrain the Lebanese government in its relationships between the ethnicities, and so they were systematically denied any rights in order to avoid causing injury to that very tenuous system. Okay, as Aaron noted, in 1970, as a result of the Battle of Karama in 1968, and prior to that, the mass Palestinian migration that occurred in 1967 of 300,000 additional people into Jordan, Yasser Arafat believed that he could coalesce more and more power to himself. You can see Yasser Arafat on the right-hand side. And so he launched an attack to remove the king of Jordan, King Hussein, and therefore turn Jordan into what would effectively be a Palestinian Arab socialist dictatorship. The Jordanian government set upon destroying this completely. Now, the estimates for the deaths in Black September vary widely. The Jordanian official government number is 300 deaths, which is almost certainly too low. The Palestinians report 20,000, which is probably closer to the mark. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was headed by Yasser Arafat and would have been the political arm of this nascent Palestinian state, was ejected from Jordan and it went to Lebanon. In terms of guaranteeing Palestinian rights in Jordan, as Aaron rightly points out, this was effectively a negative setback for the next 30 to 40 years in terms of Palestinians getting rights in Jordan. And it cemented King Hussein's opposition to granting Palestinians increased residency or governmental authority rights because they could effectively unseat him. You also have to realize that the king of Jordan is a Bedouin. And Bedouins, while they're the historic majority of the Transjordanian population, they are not the majority of the current Jordanian population because of the large number of migrants from Palestine between the 49 situation and the 67 situation. So
Rich,
yeah.
I just also, I don't know if you're going to talk about it, but even those Palestinians who have citizenship of Jordan, they are also being discriminated because that minority, they cannot be officers, for instance. There are a lot of division there because the ethnic Jordanians that are a small minority there, they have a lot of privileges that the rest of the population do not. Like, that's probably also a lot of tension internally.
Oh, absolutely. No, as I mentioned, they don't have the right to be government ministers. They don't have the right to serve in the military. Military in Jordan is disproportionately held by the Circassian minority and by the Bedouin Jordanians, of which the king is a member. So then the Palestinian, once they were removed to Lebanon, they began to try and create a functional government in the south of Lebanon. And this started in the early 1970s and led to the instability that would cause the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. So separate from this, we have a number of different campaigns. So as Zach mentioned, there was the attack on the 1972 Israeli Olympic team. You can see the team in the lower right-hand side. Those are the 12 or 14 individuals who were killed by Palestinian terrorists at the Munich Olympics. Israel decided to respond by creating Operation Wrath of God. And Operation Wrath of God was epitomized in the film Munich, where Israeli agents went across Europe, especially Western Europe, to try and assassinate different leaders of the nascent Palestinian movement, be they directly affiliated with terrorist organizations like Black September, because Black September also happened to be the name of a Jordanian terrorist group, a Palestinian terrorist group operating out of Jordan, or if they were part of the managerial wing or the political wing, Israel was desiring to take out these figures to prevent a second massacre. And so you had a number of these events. You can see a few of them on the screen there. Probably the most famous such event was an accidental assassination. So you can see Ahmed Boushiki was a Moroccan who was working as a waiter in Lillehammer, Norway, and he was alleged. He was mistakenly killed by Israelis, believing him to be the terrorist responsible for the attacks in 1972. So the Norwegian officials roundly condemned the Israeli attack and made the Israeli services leave the country for this unprovoked killing of a civilian.
So the Israeli government said, yes, we killed this person.
I don't know if they took direct responsibility, but they took responsibility in sort of a general sense.
So this is an open, they can, okay.
Yeah, no, people know that it was Israeli agents who killed Ahmed Boushiki. The next major Israeli military operation that's separate from Wrath of God was a singular operation, which was Entebbe. Entebbe is a unique Israeli operation in that there was a flight going from Tel Aviv to Paris with a stopover in Athens. Athens had notoriously poor security, which allowed several Palestinian hijackers to reroute the plane to Uganda, where Idi Amin, the dictator at the time, was friendly to the Palestinian objectives. And he allowed the plane to land and take all of the people on board hostages. Now, the Palestinian terrorists first went through the flight manifest. They found anybody who was French and not Jewish, or just generally not Jewish or not Israeli, and separated them and sent them back to Europe. But the remaining 106 passengers who were kept there, and some of the flight crew were Israeli or Jews. And so Israel wanted to devise a way of recovering them without making any concessions to the Palestinians. So as you can see on the right-hand side, they have a flight path leading from the south of Israel, well, actually from the Sinai Peninsula because they controlled it at the time, over Ethiopia, over Kenya, landing quickly in Kenya to refuel, and then going to Uganda. There are a number of elements of this that are incredibly surprising. Probably the most important one is that the distance from the Sinai Peninsula to Nairobi, where they refueled, was too far for the plane to make in a single jump. So the Israelis pioneered their first attempt at in-air refueling, which nobody thought a small country like Israel could do. When the commandos arrived in Kampala, where when they arrived, in Kampala, where they arrived in Entebbe. When they arrived in Entebbe, where the hostages were being kept, the commandos were able to secure 103 out of 106 of the hostages. They killed 20 Ugandan soldiers and all of the Palestinians who kidnappers. As I said, 3 of the hostages died, and one of the commanders, Yonatan Netanyahu, you can see his image in the center. They were Yonatan Netanyahu was the only person who died on the Israeli commando side. He is, of course, the brother of the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
It's an interesting story. There's one of the hostages had the choking accident and was sent to the hospital in Uganda. And since Idi Amin was so pissed off that Israel basically came in and quite easily recovered most of the hostages, he threw her down the stairs and she died right after.
Wow.
The other thing to recognize is that the scale of how Black September was really only around for 3-4 years. I mean, obviously it evolved from there, but the volume of attacks, like its attack vector, was it absolutely established the whole, in essence, global definition of counterterrorism that exists in 100+ countries, and created that, invented in essence the understanding that everywhere has the potential to be a soft target. So and like one of the ones most people don't know about is this 1973 New York City bomb plot, which was pretty substantial, actually, if that had ever happened. It was to detonate 3 car bombs in New York City at the same time that Golda Meir arrived. And the person who actually designed that plot wasn't caught until almost 20 years later. That was, and that was just one of dozens that they either attempted or executed. And I think one thing to also add is that, the attempted coup in Jordan, they killed the prime minister of Jordan. So this wasn't just, kind of like a goofball attempt at kind of an overthrow of the state. This was a full-fledged attempt to basically completely overthrow the state and to create, as Richard said, basically a Palestinian socialist dictatorship.
Arab dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly.
I also want to point, thank you, Aaron. And then maybe this is a controversial thing, but the Federal Republic of Germany during the 1972 Munich Olympics completely mishandled the whole situation of hostage taking by Palestinians, and didn't want to disrupt the whole Olympic movement and just wanted to hush the whole thing. And again, it's not a knock on them, and everything that was happening to the Jews, obviously prior, to World War II, they wanted to, try to minimize this whole situation as much as they could, and they let them leave pretty much unharmed. All the hostage takers with hostages were able to leave.
Well, so the thing we have to realize is that so there was this sort of, like the frog boiling. The concept of a terrorist generally was someone who had taken a group of hostages and was exchanging people for it. I mean, kind of like the old world definition for, 1,000 years, and you basically do the ransoming approach. And so you kind of see this, that most places were still operating that way, even though the approach that Black September took was, basically like a Silicon Valley innovation, right? I mean, they really amplified the breadth and the depth of their attack vectors, and that transformed. Really, nobody was prepared for that, right? There wasn't, so things that exist now, like GSG-9, the counter-terrorist infrastructure, there was none of that then. I mean, your response was either police, who were pretty radically outgunned, but also just out-trained, or you had an overwhelming military response, which in most units were basically ranger type units, which were not really designed for counter-terrorism. So they, Black September figured out this space in between that they could operate in. And for those 3-4 years, they were fairly effective in operating, within that. Now, I would say one thing is that, and I don't know if you're going to touch on this, Richard, is that these events, I think, changed a lot of support, or let's say lukewarm support that Israel had, moved more into the column of maybe not full support, but more supportive than they had before. You could say.
Yeah, I was saying in the early period before the Intifadas. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's, and of course that was, at the end of the day, that's the outcome of what a lot of what Black September did, is that it weakened their cases across the Middle East because they kept trying to overthrow governments, and then it weakened their case against Israel because
Israel was now a victim.
Yeah, exactly, because they had so many attacks.
Let Ralph speak.
Yep, sorry.
I thought that going back to the Munich Olympics, I thought that the hostages were killed because the Germans botched a commando effort to rescue them.
That was my point. I mean, it was nothing to do with them having an alpha group, so speaking, a Russian version of, commando or stuff like that. They botched the whole thing. I mean, it was just complete.
Well, okay, but remember, it's like if something doesn't exist and you're not good at doing it, then yeah, it's a revisionist view to say that they botched how they should execute counterterrorism when there wasn't a counterterrorism, template.
I think it's also interesting when you look at Entebbe, Yoni Netanyahu, the only Israeli soldier who was killed during the rescue, that he was the commander, he was the field commander of the force, which was interesting, and he is regarded as very much a hero in Israel, as you might expect.
Right.
I read his letters where he wrote very extensively during his career, and he was a memorable individual. He would not have been a liberal if he had gone into politics, by the way. He certainly would have been quite militant as a right winger, but he was in most ways the more he was the more outstanding of the two brothers, probably.
And another thing is, and which I don't know if it's true or not. Remember when Golda Meir was asked, are you going to negotiate with terrorists? And her famous line was, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." And also, it was offered by Israel to help Germans, with this kind of situation, because they were familiar with this whole, prior to other attacks that was happening. And Germans said, "Sorry, Olympics, we can't do it."
Yeah, but I mean, that's not unique, right? I mean, you don't generally have external forces on your soil, the political repercussions of that are just beyond explosive. It almost doesn't matter what country it is. I mean, I'm a little more defensive about West Germany's response to this, because
if you let one country, you have to leave everybody else. So, I mean, why let Israel come in and not other countries?
Well, yeah, and
right?
it also speaks to I mean, you just lose all the support of your defense and security industries. I mean, it's just everybody sort of.
Oh, but the sensitivity of the fact that the 6 million Jews were killed.
Obviously,
that was my point. Like that was almost like, no, we're right now currently handling Olympics, and we just have to do it. Let them leave. We botched it, and okay, it's on us. Let them leave. That was my whole premise. Maybe I'm wrong.
But understand that was not very different than what was happening in Italy. With the Meinhof gang, or with or Red September, or Red Star, etc. I mean, you had, this wasn't. I mean, it wasn't unique that you had a lot of very, very dynamic, what you would call, armed, whether it's terrorist or militant kinetic groups that were running around Europe, that were either being directly or indirectly supported by various actors. And so this was a new evolution in understanding security. I mean, it's just I mean, we could sit there and say they should have had a GSG-9 that was ready, trained, and built, but I don't know how that would have happened. It's
in 1978. We have the first time that Israel intervenes in the conflict in Lebanon, right? So we've started the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. And the particulars of most of the Lebanese Civil War are actually not terribly relevant to Israel. But there are two parts that are really worth stressing. The first one is that there are two major forces operating in the south of Lebanon in the early part of the war. And one of them is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? We mentioned how they have fled from Jordan since Black September and are now operating primarily in Lebanon. And so they're operating in the south that's very close to the Israeli border. And you have a number of cross-border raids and attacks that begin to occur. The second major group, which is represented by that shield with the cedar and the blades crossing it, that is the South Lebanon Army. Now, the South Lebanon Army was a Christian phalangist group. Their inspiration was a number of fascist movements in Europe, just like many of the Muslim side militias as well. Hezbollah has a lot of fascist iconography as well. But the SLA was amenable to having relations with the state of Israel. And you can see in the upper left-hand side a meeting between the South Lebanon Army and the IDF. During Operation Litani, the Israeli SLA relations were actually less cordial than they would eventually become, with the SLA becoming increasingly a stalwart ally of the state of Israel. And so they assisted the Israeli government in pushing up to the Litani River. You can see on the map on the right-hand side, the Litani River is that light blue line. So between the dark blue line, which is the Israeli-Lebanese border, and the Litani River, which is that light blue line, Israel advanced with the help of the SLA and left control of the territory in the SLA's hands. The one exception, of course, is the city of Tyre, which you can see on the coast, and the city of Tyre was not occupied. But what really forced the Israelis' hand into moving into Lebanon in Operation Litani was the attack of the al-Mughrabi. You can see on the left-hand side, she is a terrorist from Fatah, the organization of the Palestinian Liberation, the part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that Yasser Arafat was directly leading. And she entered Israel illegally and attacked a number of civilians on the beach in what's known as the coastal attack. 38 Israeli civilians were killed. In the ensuing fighting, she was killed by Israeli police officers. The Palestinian world considers her a martyr. The UN and the Israeli government have both denounced her as a terrorist. She is one of the first women martyrs in this way, if not the first. So In 1979, we see a massive shift in the Middle East in general, and the shift comes sort of in two parts. The first one, as you see on the left-hand side, is that Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt, respectively, make a peace treaty for Israel to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, in return for Egypt to recognize the state of Israel and have peace with it. This puts Egypt firmly in the American camp, where they had previously been in the Soviet camp. Remember, the Soviets, as late as 1970, were fighting on Egyptian soil. You had Soviet soldiers in Egyptian soil fighting the War of Attrition. Anwar Sadat, by accepting Israel, is now firmly in the American sphere and using the relationship with Israel to get concessions from the Americans. But at the same time, it meant that Israel would have a steady supply of oil, which was hugely necessary because at roughly the same time, you have the Islamic Revolution in Iran. You can see on the lower right-hand side protests for Khomeini to be installed as the supreme leader. One of my favorite funny things about the sign in the blue is that in both that in Persian, Arabic, and Hebrew, it says death to Israel, and then in the English it says down with Israel. Just to tone it down for the Western audiences who might get more queasy at the word death. But this was a common refrain in Iran, and Iran under the Shah previously had been a functional partner of Israel. Ally might be stretching it, but they were definitely doing defense coordination, and Israel was involved in Iran's nuclear facilities as well, because Iran was trying to develop increasing nuclear technology in the 1970s.
Well, both countries were totally supported by the United States, so.
Absolutely.
And this was during the Cold War, obviously. So, this
Yeah.
is, the balance of power, basically. And this event was a big deal, obviously. Both of these events, actually.
Yeah. From the Israeli perspective, it completely realigned their defense priorities, right? Because prior to Anwar Sadat making peace, as we've seen in the Independence War, the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the dominant threat was coming out of the Fedayeen as well. The dominant threat was coming out of Egypt. In all those cases, right? Israel had to resolve the Egyptian front of the Independence War before they got to the Jordanian or Syrian fronts. It was Nasser who was paying for the bulk of the Fedayeen who invaded in the 50s. It was Nasser who got the large air force that Israel decided to strike first before going after Jordan or Syria. And in fact, in the case of Jordan, Israel waited until Jordan made direct attacks against them to make a move. And the War of Attrition and the Six-Day War, the War of Attrition and the Yom Kippur War were primarily Egyptian attacks against Israel. So this change fundamentally meant that Israel could move troops away from its border with Egypt and reposition them. At the same time, because of Iran's significantly larger size and larger ambit, Israel now was worried and would increasingly become worried about a proxy war with Iran. So Iran, of course, was not the only threat that Israel faced. Israel also faced the threat of a nuclear Iraq. And so you can see there on the right-hand side, the Osirak reactor. This was a reactor built in collaboration between the French government and the Iraqi government. And Israel sent fighter jets. You can see sort of a stylistic representation on the left-hand side across Jordanian territory illegally to bomb this reactor. It was one of Israel's most successful missions, and it boosted the prime ministership of Menachem Begin. His liberal critics wanted to undermine it, but of course, it was seen as just trying to poke down somebody who really won effectively. So he easily won re-election for the Likud party. But generally speaking, this prevented Iraq from ever acquiring nuclear weapons, given that Iraq's technology would be completely stymied when the United States destroyed them after the Persian Gulf War.
So how was the UN or how were the international groups reacting to this? One country coming and bombarding another country. I mean,
sure, there was international condemnation, especially from the Arab world and from the Soviets. The French gave a very vociferous condemnation because several of their civilians were killed in the bombing. But the United States, I believe, either supported it or was silent. The UN released a functional statement about, national sovereignty, but didn't really do anything serious.
So they didn't condemn it. They didn't say
No.
yes.
The UN condemned it as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty and of Jordanian airspace, but they didn't actually, do anything. That Israel wasn't given sanctions, for example, and it wasn't really debated.
Yeah, the other thing to realize too is that back at the moment the Black September movement attempted the coup in Jordan, Jordan's stance and or lack of support from other Arab states at that point, they started to evolve, let's say, their relationship with the Israelis. And the Israelis, over time, they developed a pretty, and obviously going back over 50 years now, have developed a fairly, I would say, functional working relationship with the Jordanians, and especially when it comes to larger threats. So, the Jordanians would often sort of theatrically condemn certain things, but then behind the scenes be support, and maybe not fully supporting, full-throated support, but they would be offering technical aid or intelligence support.
Exactly.
Quick question. Have anybody heard of, I'm sorry, Mark, and
Yeah.
So anybody heard of Operation Diamond, 1966? During the 1967 war, United States and Israel wanted to get MiG-21 technology that Russians developed that presumably were superior technology. And Americans paid $1 million to Iraqi, I guess, pilot, because of the Iraqi army was supplied with MiG-21, and he flew that plane to Israel to get the technology. Maybe it's on a separate topic, but it's an interesting topic too. I guess because of the several countries, communist country like Soviet Union was supplying Iraq up until the Shah was deposed, and Iran was supplied by United States. All the technology transference also was kind of used during those wars. It's called Operation Diamond, if anybody wants to look it up. Sorry.
So in 1982, Israel went back into Lebanon as there were a number of cross-border raids. And again, Israel cooperated with the South Lebanon Army. But the South Lebanon Army was one of many Lebanese Christian armies. You can see the route of the Israeli invasion in the lower right-hand side. They progressed in parallel up the coast from Tyre to Sidon to Damour to Beirut, and they besieged Beirut. So from 1982 to 1985 is the bulk of the Israeli invasion. And you can see that they move all the way up to the Shuhuf Mountains that link Beirut to the Syrian border. During this time, you can see in the central picture Ariel Sharon and Bashar Gemayel. Gemayel was a Christian Maronite leader of Lebanon, and he was willing to negotiate with the Israelis. Sharon basically asked him for a peace treaty. He said he was willing to do a non-aggression pact, but not a peace treaty. He didn't think that it would go over well with the Muslims and would lead to further violence in the country. It's believed that Sharon may have overplayed his hand and said, "It's our tanks around Beirut." To which Gemayel said, "Here are my hands, put manacles on them. I'm not going to be your vassal. I'd rather be your prisoner." So at that point, Sharon sort of backed off. Gemayel was then assassinated, which eroded any real support that Israel may have had in having a long stake in Lebanon. Now, you can see that if you look at the map in the upper right-hand side, that the area that the PLO controlled was directly in the area that Israel took over, starting from 1982 to 1985. And the map of the PLO is from 1981. So you can see that Israel's invasion was directly to remove or limit the control of the PLO in the country. In 1985, the Israeli invasion was more or less ended, and Israel withdrew to what is called the security zone, and you can and that area is indicated on the map on the left-hand side in both colors of blue. Israel would later withdraw to only the dark blue areas as UNIFIL took over the periwinkle areas. Now, in the center left picture, that is the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Now, the Sabra and Shatila massacre was primarily perpetrated by the South Lebanon Army against the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. Israel was in military control of the area and was aware of the massacres while they were going on, but did not intervene. Israel has been held in the international community as guilty as an accessory to these massacres, but it was the South Lebanon Army that actually perpetrated them directly. In 1982, we also see the formation of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah and Aman, which were both two different Shiite militias, were the prominent forces that were opposing Israel in the south of Lebanon, where there's a Shiite majority population. In addition to the PLO, but the PLO is disbanded from Lebanon and expelled as a result of the Lebanese Civil War. Israel maintained control of the security zone from 1985 until 2000, when Ehud Barak withdrew it. The withdrawal of Israel from the security zone in Lebanon was widely seen in Israel as a failure, and widely seen by Hezbollah in Lebanon as a success, because they were the primary opponents of Israel maintaining that security zone, launching a war of attrition against them in the late 80s and throughout the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty widely accepted that that the Israelis escalated into a conventional conflict, which is, they were dealing with an asymmetrical foe, and that shifted the advantage ultimately to the asymmetrical foe or foes, and then their inability. So it turned it into a political, commitment at that point, and then any kind of de-escalation or changing of tactics was seen as a failure, which it almost like a micro Vietnam, really, in some ways. But it in a weird way, it's sort of like the Israelis were fighting this like it's Vietnam, and the militia groups were fighting like they were the FARC in Colombia. That's how I've always sort of seen it. It's sort of like, so you had a much longer political movement, which, the FARC almost 50 years now. And I think, I've looked at it that way for quite a while, because I think it offers a way to understand how difficult it is to de-escalate and to change sort of direction on all parties.
Aaron, what do you call asymmetrical from the beginning? I mean, that is an unjust thing that is.
Well, no. Okay, so when something is, when it comes to at least military or security affairs, when something is symmetrical, it's highly conventional, meaning tanks, ships, planes, etc. When something is asymmetrical, so there's asymmetry, right? There's an unevenness. That would be a guerrilla force. That would be a force that would be using special operations or hybrid war. Like, you could argue what the Russians do in the East, in what's now Eastern Europe, is basically a lot of asymmetrical, what are people calling hybrid war. And so you're using all these different sort of tactics. You're like a fusion chef, basically. And so the Israelis really, I mean, if being objective, never adopted this in any consistent manner. It actually exposed a huge
on their military system.
Yeah, and their whole military system has been sort of an internal conflict that even to this day sort of exists. I mean, now there's enough of a new generation, so you're seeing this shift from large forces to smaller, more dynamic. But if you look at how the United States responded after Vietnam, or the Russians after Afghanistan, you know, the Israelis actually were a lot slower in responding to this, even though these events happened, you know, basically after, you know, Vietnam or Afghanistan. So, and obviously there's a whole moral calculus here that was going on, you know, at all levels, that hasn't changed and probably won't ever change. But that's a different, I mean, to me, that's a different, you can't, it's hard to put those two together.
No, I think
Right.
that's a really important point, that Israel's shift from fighting the Arab states to fighting these militia groups like Hezbollah, like Amman, like the PLO, required a completely different set of tactics, because unlike a nation state, these organizations don't have land, they don't have wealth, they don't have the way you destroy them is the way you destroy any criminal organization, is by arresting the members and removing their leaders. But Israel hadn't adapted to that.
And their infrastructure, which is often social infrastructure. See, that's where it gets, that's why, I mean, that's so your point around asymmetry, that's where it gets dirty, is the asymmetry.
Yeah.
But the Israelis were aware that the Hezbollah built the network of underground tunnels,
Sure.
right? And attacking it with tanks. I mean, it seems to be a little bit illogical.
I mean, we were aware in Vietnam that it was a jungle. The Soviets were aware that there was the Pashtuns. I mean, it's when large states' political culture, and typically, you know, the old saying, you're fighting the last war, and your leaders tend to be people with the last war bias, right? They're your OGs, right? They're kind of your cultural OGs, and so they're the most resistant people. You know, you can read these really fascinating stories in the 80s of, you know, coming from, you know, low level officers in the Israeli and the IDF who really hadn't fought any of those old historic, you know, almost biblical wars in the Israeli creation story, saying, I don't really care about what we did in 73 or 67 or 56 or 29, blah, 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 blah. You know, they just were like, that isn't what I'm seeing. That's not what's right in front of me. And you could find the same exact correspondence. There's people who've written papers on this in the War College, you know, coming from Vietnam based officers in the United States Army, and also Afghan officers, the Soviet Army, who were basically saying exactly the same thing in their own language. Like, I don't really care about the Great Patriotic War. That has nothing to do with Afghan, you know, that has nothing to do with the sandhill in front of me.
I have a question though. Do we have any evidence that Israeli found a way how to counteract these kind of tactics nowadays? Because I don't think they had another war.
No,
like that.
I mean, the best they've done is they have at least a very strong minority of leaders in their military and intelligence who believe in asymmetry as a strategy, and they get sort of second dibs when the first dibs fails, which it almost always does. So they get to go in second. I mean, I think a lot of this, to be honest,
but also Israel has had a tactical shift, and we're going to discuss some of that tactical shift as we move on. And Israel learned how to fight asymmetrically to a better extent than a lot of other armies, because they were faced with it for decades.
But they still haven't adopted it in their machismo culture. That's really what I'm arguing.
But one thing that I find it very, I mean, different or weird, I mean, it's like Israel can bombard Iraq. What I'm thinking is Iran bombard Israel. What will be the reaction? I mean, I think everything is very asymmetrical. Because
sure, but that word is specifically used in a military context to mean that the two sides are not fighting on the level, because they have different motivations and goals in terms of
and capabilities too. Yeah. I mean, the Lebanon cannot stand up to
international support, because how can you?
I agree with you. I agree with you that Israel has a different perception in the international community than Iran did. Certainly in 1981, when Iran was still coming off the revolution and Hussein had just invaded them.
I mean, look, if you want to be objective about, look at the world's response to Egypt and fighting the Israelis in the, you know, in the 50s and 60s. I mean, that is sort of what it would be. where you did have a big chunk of the world either not necessarily very supportive of Israel, or outright supportive of the Egyptians. So there is that dynamic. It's not all one way all the time. It's just these things shift. I mean, to be very honest, my contention is the most destructive event in modern Palestinian history is the creation of the Black September organization. BSO demolished their brand.
What about before that? What about the Palestinians that they live in Palestine and suddenly they don't have any rights? I mean,
get that, but my point is human beings, generally speaking, don't live over a 300-year or 100-year continuum of chronological history to make daily decisions. They go with what's right in front of them. And the BSO, especially in the 70s and into the 80s, became sort of brand PLO, and that was, very, very, I mean, that was very, very destructive to their, to their larger aims, I guess is the whole point. And there's modern corollaries to this, right? So when in essence a small breakaway, the Taliban from larger, Pashtunistan, basically, right? The, nearly 40-50 million Pashtuns, that became brand Pashtun. And they've, I think, done a reasonably average job to try to shift that, but there's still an association with it. And I think that's, the larger aim is you get more radical individuals or groups, for obvious reasons, who then can take on more destructive aims, but they don't square with the long-term objectives that you have, especially if your goal is something like a civil right type of development. And I think that's a you see this over and over. It's not unique to the Palestinians. I mean,
yeah. All right, let's continue.
Yeah. So so Israel was sort of lukewarmly involved in the Lebanon conflict, right? Between 1985 and 2000, they were maintaining the occupation zone, but by and large, their role in the actual civil war had ebbed. The Lebanese Civil War itself ended in 1991, but the Israeli involvement was primarily, at that point, supporting the SLA and holding their southern area. At this time, we see the Palestinian movement re-centralize in the West Bank, and Yasser Arafat declares the first Intifada, or the first rising up. And the way that they decide to do this is through the use of suicide bombers. While there had been suicide bombers before, there was no tactical use of them. In this case, it was the tactic. This is the way that Israel would be destroyed. And at first, Israel did not have a method of containing these attacks. And they were low scale but consistent throughout this period. I believe there were roughly 3,000 Palestinian self-bombers between 1987 and 1993. Yitzhak Rabin, as Israeli Prime Minister, became the first one to really reach out to the Palestinians and try to create some sort of accord or agreement. You can see on the left side, this is a more recent map, but you can see basically where in red all of the Israeli settlements are, and the major cities, of course, are majority Palestinian. Israel's response primarily to the first Intifada was to arrest individuals responsible if they could catch them before they exploded. Obviously, if they were exploded, they couldn't really be arrested. There began to be talks about collective punishment. Collective punishment really solidifies in the second Intifada, but you begin to see arrests and criminal investigations into Palestinian networks, especially those that are based in Israel. But by and large, the Israeli response is to try and just find the people before they explode. So in the 1990s, you can see Yitzhak Rabin on the left-hand side shaking hands with Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. On the right-hand side, you can see him shaking hands with King Hussein of Jordan, 93 and 94 respectively. Yitzhak Rabin made overtures with the Yasser Arafat, and so Yasser Arafat ended the first Intifada, and this resulted in the Oslo Accords, which divided the Palestinian region into three distinct categories. You have Zone A, which is exclusive Palestinian civil and military control. You have Zone B, which is Israeli military control with Palestinian civil control, and Zone C, which is exclusive Israeli civilian and military control. What I mean by that is that if I say civilian control, I'm talking about the internal administration of the region, and military control as in the governance of the region. The majority of the Palestinian population was in the Zone A areas. The majority of the actual territory was Zone C, which means that the Palestinian West Bank and the Gaza Strip effectively became Swiss cheese, where Israelis controlled the cheese and the Palestinians controlled the holes. This put the new Palestinian government, because the PLO was reincorporated as the Palestinian Authority, with the ability to make civil domestic decisions in the holes of the Swiss cheese, for want of a better term. It made Israel the primary tax collector and distributor for the Palestinian Authority. It also made Israel the primary security guarantor for the Palestinian Authority. Although Palestinian police were trained in Jordan as part of the peace relationship between Israel and Jordan in 1994. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli, Yigal Amir. You can see him at his trial on the right-hand side. On the left-hand lower side, but he's in the right side of the picture. Yigal Amir argued that he was following the religious principle of Rodef, meaning that if you see somebody and you know with certainty that he is going to kill a third person, and there's nothing you can do to stop him other than killing him, it is your obligation to kill him. Using this idea of Jewish law, he assassinated Rabin, arguing that Rabin was in the process of killing Israel, and that only by killing Rabin could he save Israel. He was incarcerated for assassination of a sitting prime minister. But the Oslo Accords endured until, without remarkable change, until about 2000. Yasser Arafat had remarked that he never trusted an Israeli official again after Rabin.
Yeah.
All right, any questions? All right, so then we move into the second Intifada, which starts in 2000 and 2005. The stated reason for the Intifada is, as you can see in the center, Prime Minister of Israel Ariel Sharon walked into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to the Dome of the Rock Shrine. Those are areas that, according to Jewish halachic law, Jews are not allowed to be in. And just as a functional Israeli matter, Israel has given control of the area of the Temple Mount to the Islamic Waqf, or the Islamic Land Trust. And the Islamic Land Trust has also decreed that Jews are not allowed on that territory. So as the prime minister and a clear Jew, one that has been involved in Israel's wars before, this was supposedly the reason for the second Palestinian Intifada rising up. Now, from most historians would argue that there was a Palestinian Intifada in the works, and they were looking for their catalyst event. Think very similarly to Kristallnacht, where it was supposed to look spontaneous, but actually had a lot of planning behind it. The second Intifada resulted initially in a much higher rate and a potency of the suicide bombers. Israel took a large number of casualties, and there was an attack almost every week, if not more often than that.
Yeah,
you can see on the lower.
Key point too is that, to your prior conversation, is that there wasn't unity in the Palestinian cause when it came to negotiation. So Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah
And Hamas.
and Hamas actually actually wanted to disrupt the talks that were going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and so there was an internal counter revolution that was really pretty substantial, and I'd say basically, if I'm being objective, it's pretty effective actually in the end.
in preventing peace. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And in preventing peace, it basically degraded the trust on all sides to such a degree that it just everything, kind of just cycled backwards into, a 2.0 version of the 80s, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there are two major differences in the Second Intifada, in addition to the ferocity. One of the primary ones you can see in the upper left-hand side is that Israeli commandos began to actually enter the West Bank, specifically Palestinian refugee camps and large cities, in order to find and take down Palestinian terrorist organizations. Previously, during the first Intifada, Israel played primarily defensively, trying to prevent people from exploding before they exploded. In the second Intifada, Israel actually went out into Palestinian towns and cities, took over houses, and fought a street-to-street campaign in several of the cities, especially Jenin. The second, as you can see in the lower left, is that Israel began the construction of the separation barrier. The separation barrier was first built around Tel Aviv. You can see the concrete part, which has been called the wall, surrounding the area of Abu Dis, being it's a Palestinian enclave in Jerusalem that the Palestinians consider their administrative capital, even though the majority of the administrative capital offices are in Ramallah, since the size of Abu Dis and its difficulty of access makes it unworkable as a capital city. But since Abu Dis is part of the wider city of Jerusalem, it maintains the Palestinian claim that Jerusalem is their true capital. So Israelis built the wall section, the concrete wall section at Abu Dis, and continued extending the security barrier from 2004 through 2006 along the border of Israel and the West Bank, diverting into the West Bank where there were Israeli settlements deemed worthy of protection. The separation barrier decreased the Palestinian ability to send in suicide bombers by over 90%, and most of the leaders on the Palestinian side remarked that they had to find new inventive ways to attack Israel now that the age of the suicide bomber had ended.
Yeah, and I think one thing to also recognize is how unique the support in the population is for that tactic, right? So when you look outside of the Palestinian territories or Lebanon, the support for suicide operations is, generally speaking, rarely, sometimes, or often. Pew's done the research. I'll put the link in, but it's typically in that 10 to sort of 20-ish% at most. And in that region, and including parts of Jordan, the support is between 60 and 80%. I mean, so it's so far off the handle in terms of the norms. Like, you don't see those percentages nowhere near that in Pakistan, across Central Asia, North Africa. I mean, it all holds in that in that range. Turkey's sort of one that's higher than normal. It's around 40%, but it's 70, 80. It's in the Palestinian territories. It pretty much holds in the 70s and 80s as a percentage. So which is you don't find that you get that kind of support for mom and apple pie, right? I mean, it's just like it's so far out there. So it's become almost cultural, really, at this point, which I think is really long-term problematic, obviously. But
yeah, the next Israeli military operation that Sharon committed himself to was the Gaza Disengagement. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is a map of the Gaza Strip, as it was in 2005. The areas that are in blue on the lower left-hand side of the map, the southwest, those are the majority of the Israeli settlements. There are some blue areas elsewhere in the Strip. Those are smaller Israeli settlements. And the Israeli military was mobilized to remove the settlers who refused to be relocated. You can see on the right-hand side, settlers refusing to go and pelting an Israeli security officer, I believe, with eggs and cream. Yeah. Many of the settlers had to be carried from their homes. At the same time, Sharon increased the size of several settlements in the West Bank, showing that this was primarily a Gaza disengagement, believing that Gaza could not be held. Between the years 2005 and 2007, Gaza was controlled by the Palestinian Authority, but of course, in 2006, with the Palestinian elections and the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip, that territory came under Hamas control.
I'm sorry, you said God? I didn't understand.
No, the territory came under Hamas control.
No, but before that, you said that the Israelis said that they were, why they have the...
Oh, the Israeli authorities believed that holding on to the Gaza Strip was not viable in the long term, given the small number of settlers and the number of Palestinians that it would take. So those settlements were liquidated, and settlements in the West Bank were expanded.
Okay, thank you.
And this gave the Palestinians their first contiguous piece of territory. In 2006, Israel's attention turned north again. You can see in the lower part of the screen, Regev and Goldwasser. These were two Israeli soldiers put on the border with Lebanon. Hezbollah abducted them, and as a response, Israel declared war on the Hezbollah organization and went into Lebanon. So at first, they used aerial waves to try and attack Hezbollah, and then they decided to go for an all-out ground invasion. Hezbollah at the same time had Katyusha rockets. You can see the image in the center of a mobile Katyusha launching, I don't know what you want to call it, facility or rocket launcher. Katyushas were Soviet-made missiles that could hit Israel and do significant damage. And you can see on the map all those green markers where Katyusha rockets rained down. On the flip side, Israel dropped munitions all across Lebanon, and you can see where those Israeli strikes are with blue dots. The Israelis also launched a naval blockade of Lebanon and began to invade the territory directly.
And I mean, this is objectively by most people considered sort of a ham-fisted response that the Israelis had. There was a group of their, let's say legacy officers, very much like that's existed in almost every military in the world that's large, significant, strong air forces that can say, let's let the Air Force do it. We can magically change, the course of situation, which is, proven to be 0 for 500 as a strategy, but it's right up there with Chinese invasion of Vietnam. And so, this obviously didn't pan out. The thing they ultimately, I think, discovered was the scale of the rocket infrastructure that Hezbollah had developed, which is somewhere, the estimates are all over the place, but they're definitely in the tens of thousands, and maybe even some have estimated as high as in the low hundreds of thousands. So, which at a certain point makes it strategically irrelevant too. It turns it into water because you only have so many human beings that know how to use this, right? So it isn't like 9-year-olds can operate a Katyusha rocket system, right? So if you have a bazillion of them, but there's a finite number of people who can use it, it just doesn't matter to have, every unit past the number that the people who are there that can operate it is sort of a waste of that capability. But that's the cycles that they seem to be in between Hezbollah and Israel. It's like really almost a proxy war at this point.
Exactly. Additionally, given the proximity of Hezbollah structures and storage facilities to civilian areas, as you can see in the map on the left-hand side, eliminating these large numbers of missiles is just not practical.
Yeah. I mean, and that's been their innovation, is to basically construct southern Lebanon as the world's largest,
Defense bunker.
rocket missile bunker, embedded into a civilian population in history. I never want to say it's the biggest, because there's always a good answer in the Soviet response in World War II for the real right answer of a bazillion times 5. But I think in terms of what we know, this is about as big as we've seen.
And Hezbollah really did this in the 6 years after Israel withdrew. They were able to really rebuild the area. Hezbollah has its own government operations. It builds schools and healthcare facilities. They are the economy. Zach?
So no, there was a question. We still have 45% of Lebanon is Christian, right? And I guess the
41%.
government, huh?
41% last time.
41%, sorry. And so what was the political response? Or Hezbollah completely stranglehold the whole Lebanon, and basically whatever they do, there's absolutely nobody to, politically at least, to condemn it?
You have to realize that the Christians in Lebanon are not a unified organization. The South Lebanon Army, which was disbanded in 2000, and basically all of its leaders fled to Israel when the Israeli military withdrew in 2000. They were seen as traitors by everybody, including the Maronite majority. So when Israel invaded in 2006, it was almost unanimous: this is bad and this is wrong. Never mind the Israeli cluster munitions and other things that left significant parts of Lebanon difficult to inhabit, if not uninhabitable, like Tyre and Sidon. So the Lebanese reaction to this was pretty uniform. It just was a question of degree. Sunnis and Shiites had significantly less empathy for the Israelis than the Christians did. But the thing is that the the Lebanese military, as a recombined force since 1991, is still significantly weaker than Hezbollah. So there's really nothing that the Lebanese government could do, and other than just watch this war happen.
Yeah, and I think one thing to recognize is that the closest parallel is in parts of Italy with the Darnetta, the Italian mafia, right? It's just where they're just completely infused in the complete social and political infrastructure. So mounting a campaign against them internally by, other political actors, just doesn't, it's almost impossible to materialize. And you see that, multiple times in Lebanon the last 15 years, with assassinations of prime ministers, with, responses to, the ammunition dump blowing up, to, just all these meta events. And, Hezbollah is just sort of like, it's just another Wednesday. They just keep on going. And it's very similar to, if you look at sort of the Italy in the 60s and 70s and 80s, just how completely penetrated society was and its institutions with the Italian mafia. So
yeah,
it's interesting also. I mean, how much of a Shia, ethnical or religious population in Lebanon, and then also it's a proxy of Iran, currently supported by Iran. The Hezbollah.
Sure. Yeah, but in the south of Lebanon, where a lot of those attacks were coming from, that is a Shiite majority part of Lebanon, right? Lebanon is religiously mixed, but it's not uniformly mixed. So there's some areas that are more Shiite, there's some areas that are more Maronite, there are some areas that are more Melkite, some areas that are more Sunni, some areas that are more Druze. So the southern part of the country is pretty dominantly Shiite at this point.
And the campaigns that have occurred the last, really since the Civil War, have really created that environment where you get, protective enclaves, and people sort of live in their own hood, basically, because that's their trusted environment. That's their mini state within a state, basically, that they can guarantee services, they can guarantee, whatever equality of political decision making at least happens in relative form in those spaces. If you look at what Lebanon was like, 50, 60 years ago, I mean, it had a radically different trajectory than it does now in terms of a multi-ethnic Mossad.
Used
All
to be
right.
called the Switzerland of Middle East, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really
Well,
was.
no, Jordan was always the Switzerland. It was Beirut was the Paris of the
It was
Middle East.
Paris. It was
Paris. Okay.
Okay, so now we move into the Gaza conflict. And the Gaza conflict, it really starts with the 2006 election. So you can see on this map the 2006 election. The areas in yellow voted for Fatah. The areas in green voted for Hamas. This was a sweeping electoral victory for Hamas.
Yeah.
Because of this, Hamas wanted to take over the Palestinian institutions of the Palestinian Authority. Fatah refused. And so in 2007, there was a civil war in the Palestinian territories. Now, in areas in the West Bank, right? Because remember, in the West Bank, they control the holes in the Swiss cheese. Hamas could not unify its forces because Israel controlled all of the intervening territory. And so Fatah was able to maintain control of its areas in the West Bank. Gaza, however, was a unity because of the withdrawal in 2005. So Hamas became the dominant power in Gaza, and Fatah became the dominant power in the West Bank. And until today, as a functional matter, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are really two different countries under two different authority structures. The West, Fatah was brought more and more into alignment with Israel. As much as they may vocally deny it, they are functionally working with the Israeli government because otherwise they would never receive their tax revenue. On the Hamas side, though, they made it very clear that they would only ever sign Hudna, which is a temporary ceasefire with Israel. They would not accept the legitimacy of the Jewish state. So in 2006, you had the abduction of Gilad Shalit. You can see the propaganda poster in the center of a Hamas agent holding up a picture of Gilad in his military uniform, and a second picture behind barbed wire of him in his detention cell. And it says, "Support our heroes." And then this is an Arab expression for like Happy New Year. You say, "Kul am wa antum b'khair," all years and you are well. But instead of you, they wrote Gilad. So all years and Gilad is and a new Gilad. So basically, the idea would be that they would keep using Gilad as a weapon against the Israelis, and perhaps every year they would take a new hostage to bring suffering upon the Israelis. So this resulted in several Israeli operations to assassinate key leaders in the Hamas government, and some of those assassinations led to the outbreak of war. The first major war in Gaza was called Operation Cast, led by the Israelis, and the Gaza massacre by the Palestinians. You can see that the main trajectory by which Hamas would attack the Israelis was through tunnels. You can see an Israeli soldier in those tunnels after their discovery. The ground in between Gaza and Israel is relatively flat and devoid of large stones. So it's actually relatively easy to drill these tunnels and fortify them later with concrete roofs. And Israel launched a ground invasion in December of 2008 that remained until January of 2009, at which point the UN Security Council and the United States especially brokered a ceasefire agreement. There were numerous violations of the ceasefire between 2009 and 2012 from both sides before Israel responded with Operation Pillar of Defense. Pillar of Defense was almost exclusively an air campaign. There was no invasion of the Palestinian territories at this point. And finally, the resolution was an Operation Protective Edge, where Israel deployed its new Iron Dome system. You can see in the upper right-hand side, Iron Dome is an anti-rocket system because the majority of the Hamas ability to violate the ceasefires was through the use of Qassam rockets that would hit nearby Israeli villages like Sderot. By using the Iron Dome system, Israel was able to intercept these rockets before they would hit populated areas and took out the primary advantage that Hamas had.
And a big, so it's like, if you summarize, the wall, the Iron Dome, air defense, and then now this shift to basically very, very small tactical kinetic drones, so that they aren't even flying their air force. It's like that's really become the Israeli defensive posture going forward, and there hasn't really been Hamas and Hezbollah have not figured out a way to sort of change that calculus, at least within Israel. They try outside of Israel, whether it's in southern Lebanon or other places, to create destabilization. But that's I think one thing to kind of recognize is just, you know, they've figured out, at least at this point, the defensive posture, and the Palestinians haven't evolved their cyber, which should make, you know, that should be an asymmetrical advantage, but they have not evolved that enough, you know, and they don't get support for it from the Iranians, from anybody. So, because I don't think anyone trusts that they won't just come right back on them. So anyway, so that, I think that's a couple points to sort of square too.
These various wars each had a casualty rate on the Palestinian side of between 1,500 and 2,000 people. As I said, Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge were the two where Israeli soldiers actually marched into the Gaza Strip, which were the only times that Israeli soldiers have been in the Gaza Strip since the withdrawal in 2005. All three of them, although, had air defense. You can see the white phosphorus, which Israel used. According to the Geneva Convention, white phosphorus cannot be used in civilian areas. So Israel got in a lot of trouble from the UN for having done this. Otherwise, as Aaron put it quite correctly, Hamas has constantly needed to attack Israel in a way that Israel can't block. From the suicide bombers, then the wall happened, so the rockets happened, now Iron Dome exists, and they haven't figured out whatever that third generation is of the thing that can penetrate Israeli defenses. Gilad Shalit has since been returned to Israel, as Regev and Goldwasser, the two Hezbollah captives, have also been returned to Israel. Gilad was alive at the time of his return. Regev and Goldwasser were not. In return for Regev and Goldwasser, 4 leading Hezbollah officials were released from Israeli jails. In return for Gilad Shalit, nearly 1,000 Israeli criminals, some of them serving life imprisonment for murder charges, were released. The majority of Israeli society is in favor of this exchange, but there's a significant vocal minority that feels that this was too high of a price to pay for one Israeli soldier. And so, in order to resolve the conflict, there are a number of different solutions that are being proposed. Increasingly, as the right becomes the dominant force in Israeli politics, the Caroline Biglick Israel solution seems more and more likely to be implemented than, let's say, the Geneva Initiative of 2003, as you can see on the left-hand side, which will create 2 independent but highly connected states, or the Federation Movement, which would create 1 state with different cantons, subject to different legal situations. And under the Israel solution, since the population of Palestinians in the West Bank is about 2 million, 2,100,000, a unified Israel West Bank country would have a population that's about 70 or 65% Jewish, and the remainder would be Arab, which is enough to guarantee a Jewish majority, but it's not. But it's around the 2/3 mark, so it's in danger of becoming a binational state. And once we put the Palestinians down, the Syrian Civil War has had adverse effects for Israel because it has allowed Iran to extend its influence first through Iraq, then to Syria, so they have a direct position on the Israeli border, and Iran has been sending several of their missiles and commanders over into Syria. You have General al-Haddadi. Al-Haddadi was one of members of the Al-Quds Force. He was a general in the Al-Quds Force, which is an Iranian paramilitary organization that's affiliated with the government. And in 2015, he was assassinated in what's called the Mazrat Amal incident, which is when the Israelis bombed him right out of the sky. You can see also Israel has attacked Soviet and Iranian-created weapon systems, such as the SA-17. You can see on the right-hand side. In 2013, there was an attack. You can see the casket for al-Haddadi in the center. He was buried in Iran after being assassinated in Syria. It was In Iran, it was extremely controversial that war was not declared on Israel or that there were no retaliatory strikes given, that he was the guardian of the Islamic Revolution, which is a very high, prestigious position, a very prestigious position within the Iranian military command structure. You have the SA-17, as I said, which was a Russian-made surface-to-air military system that the Iranians had provided to the Syrians, and Israel targeted in 2013 in the Rif Dimashq. Syria has tried to respond. They argue that they have fired S-200 Russian-made missiles at Israeli aircraft and downed them. Israel has not recorded that they have any downed aircraft. Syria has not demonstrated any of the aircraft that they have downed. So in all likelihood, this is bluster, but that is the situation.
Yeah, and I think this is another one of these shifts that that Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and the occupied territories have strategically, is that they're highly dependent on Russian modernization in Iran when it comes to the latest and greatest. And the Russians have been pretty clear about not deploying or not allowing their technology, even the S-400s, forget about the S-400s, to get deployed in region, because they don't obviously trust whether they would shoot down Turkish or Israeli or just civilian planes, whatever. So there is this balance that we're sort of stuck in, that the next iteration technologically, which seems to be cyber, and it seems to be that's the piece they have not been able to crack. And the question is, are they going to be able to do that? And basically, do they trust each other enough to do that? Because that's what it requires, right? If you're going to have, Palestinian hackers, 2 miles away from something they want to hack, and they can tap the fiber, but you need the support all the way up the code chain back into Iran. That requires a level of trust that, clearly isn't there yet, or isn't demonstrated yet at any scale. So I think that'll be an interesting sort of evolution.
Me, and I don't know if Risha is going to get to that. And to your point, Aaron, you have a lot of Hezbollah that's fighting in Syria right now.
Yep.
And bringing all those weapons, almost, they got carte blanche basically to, now Russia has S-400 in Syria right now deployed.
Yeah, but those are Russian S-400s.
But I understand. I'm just saying that,
what I'm saying is that's Russian air defense. That's for their own air base. That's not like Syrians have any control.
But they also upgraded to S-300, the Syrian, right?
My bet is that they were very clear that if you use these 300s and down an Israeli aircraft, you will not get any spare parts. I mean, it's because that is a substantial escalation, because basically the Israelis will bomb those sites that flare them.
Then what's the point of having it if you're not planning to down the attacking aircraft?
No, I mean, look, most strategic escalation defense is so that neither side begins their escalation ladder. That's what really goes on, right? Like there's
so it's accepted that Israeli can attack Syrian and Iranian sites without any.
I'm sure the Russians have deployed enough proxy Russians to appropriate places and told the Israelis that there's Russian citizens at these, X, Y, and Z locations, signaling these are not places you probably want to bomb. And then that's the cat and mouse game that they're playing, that both sides are playing. Russia has no dog in the fight of an escalating Syrian can't pay for 3 S-300 missile platforms trying to attack and eventually shoot down some Israeli planes, who then eventually overwhelm it and blow them up. And then, it's just like there's no win in that one from Russia from a strategic standpoint. So, it doesn't, and it doesn't work, right? I mean, you have to see it as sorts in terms of that escalation ladder. The Russians don't get anything out of that. I mean, if anything, the benefit that the Russians have in this is that it keeps Turkey off balance when it comes to Syria, because the Russians do not want the Turks to, and most others don't either, to expand into basically northern Syria. So
Russia don't care about Turks not as much as they care about the United States more than anything. If you
no, look, it's the real world. You care about your proportional challenge in each region you're in. I mean, the United States, the Russians don't care about the United States in Kyrgyzstan. They care about the stability of the Kyrgyzstanic Republic relative to the support of Russia. I mean, so it's all proportional to where they are in the world.
Well, I'm just saying Erdogan kisses Putin's ass, and it's the other way around. At this point, and we're just waiting for it to blow up at some point, but still is the case.
Yeah, most things don't actually blow up. I think that's video games and Reddit.
With Erdogan and Putin, I can guarantee you, in a couple of years, you'll see a difference.
Yeah. So that's
you mean they would quarrel, right?
They were quarreling. They almost quarreled over the plane downing by Turkish.
Look, if there was an opportunity,
a long time ago,
if there was an opportunity for that to happen, it was going to happen between the Azeri and the Armenians, right? That was the opportunity.
Well, one example is though, one thing though is Armenia has been supported by not by United States, but by what's his name, Soros, and they call him in Russia right now. They're saying it's they actually call them Sarasata, which means Soros babies. And
I know, but okay, real world. Soros is not transferring billions to tens of billions that he doesn't.
No, it's not. But it's the perception of Russians, and I'm on the Russian talk shows. I know what I'm talking about.
I get that. I get that. But when push comes to shove, and let's say the Turks and the Azeris had overplayed their hand and invaded Armenia, there was no Soros, EU, or America that was going to support the Armenians. It would have been Russian forces doing that. I guarantee you the Russians have a battle plan.
They would have never invaded because knowing that, Russia obviously has a backing. But
that's my point.
Right. That's the point. Is that it would be Russia that would be the territorial power in that part of the world.
Exactly.
Anyway. So that is the 11 wars of Israel. I think we've covered at least 11 wars, probably more. And are there any final questions about what we've seen, what we've talked about? Anything that was...
I'm just curious, what do you think, Richard, the situation in Syria, specifically Iran and Israel in Syria, how do you see this develop? Because
I really actually don't see it developing. I think that this particular situation is going to continue, that Iran is going to keep trying to bring weapons into Syria. Israel will take out the worst of the worst from its strategic defense perspective.
They can't take out everything. They
can't take out everything, but they can make it so that Iran doesn't see this as a viable corridor for long term. Okay, the feedback's on. So I think that it's basically going to stay in this sort of position. Iran and Israel have the Iranian-Israeli proxy war is relatively stable in the pattern that it's in. I don't think Iran actually has the power projection to attack Israel through the Golan. Israel certainly doesn't have the power projection to make a meaningful dent in the Iranian internal infrastructure, unless they use an atomic bomb, which of course the moment they use, they've lost diplomatic clout.
We don't want to go there.
So I don't think Israel and Iran will change in any meaningful way unless Iran itself is able to have a nuclear weapon and therefore push on the diplomatic scale.
The other thing I do think is that the Abraham Accords, which we didn't really talk about, that is a new strategic alignment. The Sunni alignment with Israel is definitely a, I mean, this is a 40, 50-year momentum of that.
Yeah.
And I do think there's something there that over time, changes some of the calculus, not all of it, but it definitely changes some of it.
I think it's actually a lot more critical than you're saying. If we remember from last time when we talked about this, Israel's predominant alliance when Ben Gurion was alive was the alliance of the periphery. Israel was allied with Turkey and with Iran. Turkey is increasingly less of an ally of Israel. They're partners to a certain degree, but it's not as cordial and friendly as it was before. And Iran is certainly an enemy. And the Arab states have switched from being the problem to being the functional allies, at least from a defense perspective. And so it could be that this gives Israel more solidity in the region because now the countries that border it are on better terms with it. And Jordan relies on Israel for its stability at this point. So I think that if there was a Syrian attack in Israel that was supported by Iran, I think that Jordan would end up being on Israel's side, at least functionally, if not militarily.
Yeah, and I also think we can't underestimate the shift into the economic realm that most of these Sunni states and North African states want to take advantage of with Israel, trading wise, and that has become a very that is arguably the asymmetry that Israel's applying now, is their economic advantages and the partnerships that they're generating with other Sunni states. And in some ways, it's almost a battle of the economic growth stories, over time.
Ralph?
Yes, when I returned from my extended absence due to a phone call, you were on the prior slide discussing various models for a resolution of the conflict, right? What interests me is something that might be called a fourth model. It would be a kind of confederation. A confederation is not a federation. Confederation means two sovereign states in some sort of relationship with each other. And the Land for All movement, there are other names for it. Their model is for Israelis who have settled in the West Bank to basically live under Palestinian law within the West Bank, within a Palestinian entity, or a Palestinian state, with the right to vote in Israeli elections, with Palestinians, with a certain number who move to what is Israel, Israel proper, being able to live there under local Israeli law, with the right to vote in Palestinian elections. There's a lot more complexity to it. It's not something I think of as an imminent solution. I do think it meets some of the problems which have kept the two sides apart. But a problem with one state kind of situation is that, I mean, it's often referred to as a binational state, but it's not, because a binational state would require that each nation has a kind of veto right, and then that there are some things which, if a proposal is considered some sort of existential threat or disadvantage to one of the nations, somehow there's a mechanism for them to say, no, we don't accept that. the kind of one state that most people talk about is a unitary state with one person, one vote, which is not a binational state. The rule is it's a majority rule, and that's why it kind of can't work, because you don't, the two peoples don't trust each other enough to say, okay, and anything that's decided by majority vote, that'll go, that's okay, because they neither side can really trust that the other side will allow basic human rights.
Right. No, that's why the one-state solution that Caroline Glick proposes excludes Gaza, right? Because she wants to cut off that 2.4 million.
Right. Very, very convenient for her to be able to, carve out the kind of unitary state that she prefers.
I mean, I think one of the things that we just can't underestimate is that, Israel's had basically continuous growth economically for 60 years. Their GDP per capita is about 44,000. The next 20 years, their GDP per capita is going to basically be Switzerland, like today's Switzerland. There is a substantial gap in development that is arguably larger than the West Germany, East Germany gap during their unification, which 30 years later is still ongoing. I mean, it's improved a lot, maybe 2/3, but it's still probably another 20 years away from having a much more normalized Germany in terms of economic growth across the regions. And in between Israel and the Palestinian territories, that difference is probably at least several factors, if not half an order of magnitude bigger than the East German, West German one. And so it's not as extreme as South Korea, North Korea. That's probably the most extreme in history. It's definitely closer as an case to something like that. And so there becomes, and you're not talking about a tiny population, right? I'm not saying tiny meaning like 200,000 is small, but that you could craft solutions. If it was 200,000, you're talking millions of people. And then also, the economic migrants that would come and claim the benefits. And so there's almost, I don't see any workable economic version of that because of the amount of investment required to redevelop would probably be on the order of $1 trillion. I mean, that's probably pretty safe to say.
I have a question. Maybe you know a little more. First of all, the Israeli Arabs do have a right of vote, right?
Yes.
They do vote. I mean, from what I read a little bit, especially from literature, from some Israeli Arab writers, there's still discrimination going on. They're still kind of segregated. There is a triangle up north. It's a social. It's similar to what's in the United States between whites and blacks, kind of. I just wonder if I understand this correctly. So there is still some segregation going on, maybe not officially, but socially.
Sure. Okay. So let's take you through the history. So between 1948 and 1966, the Arab Israelis lived in specific villages that were designated as Arab Israeli villages or cities by the Israeli government, and they were put under military control. Now, those Palestinians were still citizens of Israel, right? These Arabs were still citizens of Israel.
Yeah.
And so they were allowed to vote in elections, and there have been Arab Israelis in every single one of Israel's Knessets. Whether or not they've been part of the governing coalition is a different question, but there have always been. Now, from 1966 onward, the militarization of those cities ended, and so they're organized more or less like Israeli Jewish cities, but there are some land issues. Probably the most common one that's talked about is that Palestinian cities are demarcated with a certain area that they are supposed to. When I say Palestinian, I mean Palestinian cities in Israel, because using that to distinguish between other non-Jewish groups like Druze or Bedouin or whatever. So Palestinian cities in Israel are demarcated with a specific size that's based on the land that they control, and significant portions of Israeli land are held by the Jewish National Fund and other Jewish foundations, and so the Palestinian cities cannot grow into the areas controlled by the JNF, and there usually has to be, if they want to grow into those areas, there has to be a complicated land swap, like territory for like territory and compensation for the JNF, because JNF's covenants prevent non-Jews from living on those lands, and under Israeli law, that is a permissible covenant to have, a restrictive covenant barring Arab settlement on a certain piece of land. So that still exists. In terms of segregation, while Arab citizens of Israel can move around the state of Israel, most of them don't want to, because they believe that their fundamental claim to being indigenous people is that they live in the territory, the specific territory, the home, the neighborhood, the village that their families came from, right? Because if they move to another area, if they move to like downtown Tel Aviv, sure, they have the right to, but now they're just as deracinated as they would claim that the Jewish Israeli population is.
Yeah, there is a social hostility they would encounter, right? Probably.
There is some, but it's really much more about their own desire to maintain the.
All right.
I mean, I have a friend of mine who is Palestinian, lives in Tel Aviv, has dated everybody, is in tech, doesn't care, doesn't follow any of this stuff we talk about. So there is a population out there, like there is everywhere.
Right, right.
But
not significant. So
that's the Israeli
dream, how it's all going to be integrated eventually.
No. What I would say is that's one of the Israelis' fundamental challenge in the 2020s now, right? Where we flattened the world digitally, where you just don't have the same, excuses, answers, reasons, decades that you've had forever, decades that, certain social or economic development is conditional and contingency because of X, Y, and Z. You don't have this, you don't have that. We haven't gotten completely to the flat earth when it comes to that, but we are very close. And the shift to helping that population, especially the youth population there, become full economic actors in Israel.
But what about the West Bank? Do they have a path to migrate into the Israel proper?
No.
There's no.
Well, it depends. You can have situations with, shall we call it, intermarriage between Israeli Palestinians and West Bank Palestinians. Yeah, it can
that's
happen.
the only way.
I know people who have done that.
Correct.
Okay, but that's okay. That's very little.
I thought you meant like something where somebody moved from the West Bank to Israel on a worker visa. They stay in Israel for, let's say, 5 years.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
This does not exist. So, in terms of functional discrimination within Israel, probably the most obvious is that Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis have different school systems. Because Jewish Israeli school systems are taught in Hebrew and Arab Israeli systems are taught in Arabic. Now, there's no reason why an Arab couldn't enroll in the Jewish schools or vice versa. It's just that the understanding is that you would be learning in a foreign language to you, and therefore you wouldn't want it, and you'd be learning outside your community, and you don't want that. But
I think there's a certain advantage economically for Palestinian Israelis that want their children to be in Jewish schools if they are accepted,
and to learn the Hebrew, right?
Well, I think at this point, I think most Israeli Arabs are very fluent in Hebrew.
It goes both ways, but like the thing is that there's no law saying that they can't do this, but as a general population, they don't do this.
Israel has a civil rights problem. It's not the same kind of civil rights problem that there was in the Jim Crow South. It's not like it's legislated that people are segregated. Yeah, they do traditionally there are areas where Arabs live, there are areas where Jews live, and there are Arabs who have moved to some Jewish areas, and sometimes they have trouble. Sometimes the neighbors don't want them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's yeah, I'm sure.
And sometimes they're fine. You know, it's a whole mix up. The main problem of a civil rights issue, Richard did touch upon, which is the Arab villages, towns, and cities are in this rigid envelope where they can't expand. And so it's hard for Israeli Arabs to accommodate growing families and growing populations. That's a push into the major Israeli cities because they need housing.
If I may make a comment, you also have the curriculum, school curriculum of the Palestinians that teaches only negativity toward Israelis and Jews.
Not
that
in the Israeli Arab schools.
Right.
Not in the Israeli Arab schools.
Correct.
In West Bank, maybe, right?
The West Bank. In Israeli Arab schools, the curriculum is set by the Israeli Ministry of Education. But from most people that I've talked to who've been through the Israeli Arab school system, you have these teachers who are basically teaching it, and everybody in the room disagrees with it, but they can't say anything, including the teacher. Right? It'll be something like, "And Israel gloriously defended itself." We all agree with this. Okay. We're gonna turn the page. So it's that sort of thing. But in the West Bank, absolutely, you have these sort of depictions of you have anti-Semitic depictions of Jews. You have misstatements about what Israeli leaders have said in order to make them more bloodthirsty or more recalcitrant.
And how is that going to be addressed or ever solved? It won't.
Yeah, and how do you integrate West Bank? I mean, forget about Gaza.
I have a better question.
How do you integrate the West Bank? I mean, there's so many theories, but there's still a population is so disgruntled, so angry.
I would say this: there is a fairly larger growing population of at least Israeli Arabs, and I do think human beings, when they get opportunities that they can believe in, that they think are fair, can take advantage of. I mean, my friend, what his parents did is there's a school called Al-Qassami High School. That's like this rock star high school in northern Israel, and it's an Arab high school that sends like 75% of its students to Technion, which is like tech university, like an MIT, and so there are spaces like that,
but I'm sure these are well-to-do people who are educated.
No, they're not. They're much closer to
wrong science.
And Asian Americans who come to the United States and sort of sacrifice a third of their income for their kids to get all the educational support that they can that they can lead. What I'm arguing is that there is a very doable path through the growing part of the Israeli economy and creating a new educational architecture that's already being built in some places, that if it could be supported and expanded, you could have a fairly radical shift in that human capital, and I think overall behaviorally. And I think that's something that longer term is doable. I mean, it is doable. It's something that I think we're in the sort of cult of personality politics in the modern world, so nobody really talks about this type of stuff on any side anywhere. But this, to me, are the types of things that are actually like on the ground. You could change the game,
And it's already happening in healthcare. About 25% of the medical doctors in Israel are Arabs.
Yep.
About 33% of the nurses and other auxiliary healthcare professionals are Arabs.
Yep.
And about 40% of the dentists, so healthcare seems to be a niche where Israeli Arabs have found a way to move further into Israeli society. And they're also trying in the technical realm, of course.
Yeah. And biopharma.
I also think it's maybe it's not so obvious that really education is the foundation for eventual partnerships and respect for one another.
I mean, I hear this refrain very often. I'm not sure how much, education works to a certain degree. I think what actually works a lot better, and you could see it in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories between 67 and 87, is that a lot of West Bank guest workers did work in Israel from 67 to 87 before the first Intifada. And those built up really good relations between the Israeli employers and the Palestinian workers who came into those businesses. So I think it's not.
They were both doing this, working side by side.
Yeah, or you could do, for example, what North and South Korea have agreed to, right? You would have Israelis build factories in the West Bank and have Palestinians work there, and you would make sure that it's Palestinian administration, so it's not a settlement, right? Because that would be the first thing, is that this is a settlement. But if you build an economic relationship that can presage a real interpersonal relationship, because a lot of Palestinians, ever since the Oslo Accords, and especially in the Gaza Strip with the Hamas government, simply don't have personal relationships with Jews like their parents did. And there's a noticeable change in the Palestinian populations that is more anti-Jewish than it was in previous generations. I think.
Yeah, this was happening in the late 1990s. It got stopped by the Intifada.
Right.
So you have, yes, as you say, you have a whole generation of Israelis and Palestinians who've only seen each other in confrontation, with the Israeli in uniform and the Palestinian whatever. Whereas in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, not at all unusual for Israeli Jews to go to the West Bank to see their dentist, for example, or to go shopping. It was not unusual at all.
Yeah.
And I would say a couple of things.
Mikhail has a question.
No.
Richard, Arabs living in the West Bank, can they travel internationally? And if yes, what is needed for this?
What is the need for this?
No, what is needed? What kind of permission, document, paperwork?
The Palestinian Authority has the right to issue passports, and those passports are indicated as Palestinian Authority passports. In order for them to leave, well, if they want to go to Israel, they need to pass through a border security checkpoint along the West Bank Israel border. If they want to go anywhere other than Israel, they need to go across the. It's not the Sheikh Hussein Bridge. It's the one West Bank Jordanian border. I'm trying to remember which bridge it is. But they go across that bridge into Jordan, and then they can leave from Queen Alia Airport in Amman. That's how they travel internationally. And like any other group of people, right? They need visas and their passport to travel to a variety of destinations. They would need to get those either from consulates that are built in the West Bank, like there are a number of consulates in Ramallah, or they would go to Jordan and get their documents stamped over there. So that's how they get out. But there are passports that are issued in the name of the Palestinian Authority.
Thanks.
A couple things to also realize is that Israeli education spending, is about the OECD average, so the top 30 countries. So it's close to 10,000 per student. The Arab Israeli is about half of that, but that they've in the last 5 years really implemented a larger program to try to shift that by basically adding 1,000 a year per student, and now they're trying to add another 1,000. So there is I really do think there's a longer term synthesis here that given Israel's growth as an economy for 60 straight years, there is a path here in the development pattern that I think is pretty organic, and it's through education, and especially once you get the secondary up to a level through post-secondary, and then the capital flows, right? The talent. I mean, that's just what happens, and so I think that's something we should not sort of forget. And I think to me that's sort of how long term how the Arab-Israeli piece of it starts to change pretty dramatically the next 20 years. I think the Palestinian piece is far more challenging, obviously.
Yeah. Also, I realized that I didn't answer the second half of Mikhail's question. If you're leaving Gaza, well, good luck to you. The most common way out of Gaza is illegally through the Rafah tunnels. If you want to travel legally out of Gaza, you have to have a really, really good reason. If you're traveling into Israel, there's the Erez crossing in the north. That's the only crossing that's still open, and open is a very strong word for what it is. Like, I think fewer than 100 people pass through a week. And you would have a Palestinian Authority passport, which would be issued by Ramallah. So good luck getting that. And if you're trying to go anywhere but, then you need to cross the Rafah border with Egypt, which I think is actually a closed border at this point. Egyptian military controls it, and they don't let anybody out. So that would be, so from the Gaza side, you've been living in COVID 2020 pretty much since 1990. Sorry, so pretty much since 2007.
Thanks. It goes without question that I understand that people, if some family lives in Gaza and wants to go to relocate to the West Bank, it's practically impossible.
Yes. It can be done, but it takes about a year of negotiation.
I see.
All right, I want to thank.
And we also have to realize that the Egyptians have a horse in this race when it comes to Gaza and Hamas, and so maybe Richard, you want to throw a little color on that. I think that might be important. So it's not just I would argue there is more symmetry between the Israeli and Egyptian positions than between the Egyptian and the Hamas positions.
Oh, absolutely. The Egyptians see Hamas as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, so they see it as a functional enemy. They also see it as a disturbance on their border, because it foments the Bedouin economy in the Sinai, and that's mostly an illegal economy: drugs, narcotics, and things of that ilk, weapons.
And you saw when the Muslim Brotherhood was briefly in charge of Egypt, what they did in terms of how they opened up to Gaza, ultimately I think sealed the fate really of Gaza.
Yep. All right, I think that should be where we close, unless there are further questions.
No more questions. I want to thank you, Richard.
No more questions. Yeah, it's wonderful, Richard, as always.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you, Zach.
And
thank you so much.
Yeah, Richard is going to present another one next week, same time, 4 o'clock on.
Same time, same day. So Sunday next week.
Thank you, Richard. Wonderful.
And as I said, I'm going to present with Sam, and we're going to do stateless ethnicity. So we're going to just go around the world, talk about a few different ethnic groups that don't have their own countries, that are in various states of autonomy, various states of oppression, various states of cultural acceptance. So we'll see what it is. So obviously the point is that there's no consistent thing that it is to be a stateless ethnicity, but we're going to see a few different colors from around the world.
Are you guys going to cover the Pashtuns or no?
We're not going to cover the Pashtuns.
Okay.
What about Uyghurs? No?
We're going to cover Uyghurs.
No Uyghurs, okay. That's good. And then next Saturday at 12, we continue on our ancient Africa We started with Nubia. We're going into Ethiopia, Axiom, and so join for that. And if you want to see the schedule for the rest of it, we have a lot of good presentations coming up with Amarna letters presentations. We have Greek writing presentations. We have a lot of very good ones that's coming up. How Aristotle made its way to the Western world when it got lost from the Greeks. So it's going to be an interesting May, so to speak. So please join again, Richard. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and see you guys next week.
See everybody next week. All right, bye.
Bye. Bye, guys.